An Arab millionaire buys a single mother at an illegal auction to save her son. What he discovers shocks him. Before we start the story, share in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Layla stood at an illegal auction. A place where people traded things they didn't have the right to sell. She wore a red dress that highlighted her curves. It symbolized shame to her. Her restless eyes scanned the room, desperately taking in the scene. Men in expensive suits evaluated. Women were treated like merchandise. Layla. This was the lowest point. It was also her only auction. Her son, Amir, was very sick and urgently needed treatment. She was a waitress in a small cafe. She could never afford it. She had already sold everything of value she owned. Now, only herself remained to sacrifice. The weight of the choices that brought her there felt unbearable. Each time she thought of Amir, her heart hardened. She would do anything for him. Lot number 20. The event organizer said that the smile Karim had shown was not real and had been practiced. Layla felt her body freeze. It was her turn. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and walked toward the stage. A moment. She thought about backing out. She reminded herself, "I'm not doing this for me. This is for Amir." As she stepped onto the stage, the event organizer began describing her with rehearsed adjectives: a true gem, exotic beauty, natural grace. The words felt empty, as though he were describing an object rather than a person. Suddenly, a man sitting in the last row caught her attention. He sat silently, his serious gaze seeming to pierce through the souls of everyone in the room. Karim Al-Hassan. Layla didn't know who he was. His presence was commanding and impossible to ignore. Unlike the others, he didn't seem interested in the spectacle or in flattering the organizer. He just observed her. His expression was unreadable. The bidding began. Layla swallowed hard, trying not to show the panic she felt. The idea of being bought was unbearable. She knew this might save Amir. The auction moved quickly, with several men competing for lot 23. Each bid made her heart race. Then a deep, firm voice cut through the room. 2 million. Silence filled the hall. Everyone looked at the man in the last row. Karim Al-Hassan stood up slowly, looking very powerful and making anyone who might want to challenge him feel like they couldn't. The organizer asked, clearly surprised. After a few seconds of hesitation, he smiled and said, "Sold." Layla felt like she was going to faint. She stayed strong as she stepped down from the stage. Her eyes briefly met Karim's. Something about him made her stop. It wasn't a look of desire or superiority like the others. There was something different: determination. Karim walked toward her, stopping just a few steps away. He was tall, with sharp features, an aura of authority. Without saying a word, he extended his hand, as if offering to help her. Layla looked at him warily before accepting the gesture. "We need to talk." He spoke in a firm but controlled tone. Layla wasn't sure what was going to happen. She followed Karim into a private room. Once they were alone, he closed the door and crossed his arms. "Do you realize what you just did?" he asked, his voice serious. Layla took a deep breath. "I didn't have a choice," she said. Karim looked at her for a moment before responding. "I'm not. I'm here for fun. I didn't participate in that auction to take advantage of anyone." She frowned, surprised. Then why did you do it? Kareem leaned forward slightly, looking at her. Because if it weren't me, someone with far worse intentions would have done the same. I want to help you and your son. Layla felt his words wash over her like a wave. Both of relief. Mistrust. Why would someone like you help someone like me? Kareem gave a faint smile. One that seemed more sad than friendly. Let's just say I understand the kind of desperation that drives someone to do what you did today. Layla still wasn't sure if she could trust him. Kareem's sincere gaze made her want to believe him. If only for a moment. He continued. I'll take care of your son's treatment. I need you to trust me and agree to a few conditions. She hesitated. What kind of conditions? You and Amir will stay at my house for a while. You won't be required to do anything except take care of your son and maybe help my niece with some educational tasks. Layla's eyes widened in surprise. That's it. That's it. He confirmed. I don't want anything from you, Layla. I just want to make sure you and Amir are safe. Even though it sounded strange. Something in Kareem's voice made her believe he was telling the truth. With tears in her eyes, she finally nodded. Okay. I accept. Kareem stood up. His face serious. Good. Tomorrow. We'll start a new chapter. Layla knew her life had changed forever. That night. She had no idea that the secrets the future held would change everything she thought she knew. Layla looked out the window of the fancy car as the city blurred into a mix of lights and shadows. The silence inside the vehicle was uncomfortable. Up front, the driver kept his eyes firmly on the road. While beside her, Kareem sat in a relaxed posture. He was looking at some point far ahead. As if he were thinking about his next step. The night air was still cold. The tension between them made the air feel hot. Layla wasn't sure if she felt better or worse. Kareem's promise sounded true. She knew that nothing in life comes without a price. Where are we going? She finally asked. Her voice breaking the heavy silence. To my house. Kareem replied without looking at her. From now on, you and Amir will be under my care. Layla frowned. Why are you doing this? What's the real reason? Kareem sighed, rubbing his chin as if he'd been expecting. I've already told you. I couldn't just stand by while someone with bad intentions bought you in that place. If you can't trust me yet, I understand. Over time. I hope you will. Layla crossed her arms, holding herself as though trying to build a shield. You seem confident. How can I trust someone I've known for only a few hours, this time? Kareem turned to her. His dark eyes meeting hers. That I don't expect your trust right now. Layla, that I know that takes time. For now I want you to focus on what really matters. Amir, the mention of her son made Layla's shoulders relax slightly. She looked down at the car floor. Unable to meet Kerm's gaze any longer. That he was right, Amir was all that mattered. When they arrived at the gates of the mansion, a chill ran down Layla's spine. The place looked more like a palace, with tall iron gates that opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly. Amir couldn't meet Kerm's gaze. He was right. Amir was all that mattered. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, Layla felt a chill. The place looked more like a palace. Tall iron gates opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly arranged trees. The main house was massive. Its illuminated windows glowed like stars. Layla, who was used to cramped apartments and modest rooms, It felt like stepping into another world. As she stepped out of the car, she clutched her bag tightly, as if afraid of losing the only piece of her old life. Life that still belonged to her. Kareem walked ahead, his footsteps echoing on the marble entrance. Layla followed him, trying to take in her surroundings. Inside the mansion, everything was as impressive as the exterior luxurious furniture. Artwork hanging on the walls. An enormous crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Amir was the only thing that mattered. Layla couldn't meet Kareem's gaze. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, Layla felt a chill. The place looked more like a palace. There were tall iron gates that opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly. The chandelier dangling from the ceiling made Layla feel completely out of place. "This will be your home for a while," Kareem said, stopping in the middle of the grand hall. He gestured toward a woman approaching them. "Layla. This is Amira. She'll make sure you and Amir have everything you need." Amira was a middle. Amir couldn't meet Kareem's gaze. It's all about Layla, he thought. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, Layla felt a chill. The place looked more like a palace. The gates opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly aged cars. An old woman with a gentle smile stood there. The woman looked intimidating. Her smile was gentle. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am," she said. "Please call me Layla," she replied. Kareem nodded at Amira. "I'll leave you to get settled. Tomorrow we'll discuss the next steps," he said. Before Layla could respond, he turned and headed up the stairs, disappearing to the upper floor. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or frustrated by his abrupt exit. "Come with me, dear," Amira said, breaking the silence. "I'll show you your room and your son's." Layla followed Amira through the mansion's long, quiet hallways. Every corner seemed more extravagant than the last. Finally, they arrived at a door that Amira opened carefully, revealing a spacious bedroom decorated in soft tones and elegant furniture. There was a large bed, a wardrobe already stocked with clothes, a small table adorned with fresh flowers. "This is your room," Amira said. "Your son's room is just next door. The doctor will be here in the morning to examine him. If you need anything, I'll be nearby." Layla gave her a faint smile. Amir was the only thing that mattered. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, Layla felt a chill. The place looked more like a palace. Tall iron gates opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly. The contrast between the luxury surrounding her now and the simple life she had left behind was almost overwhelming. She sat on the edge of the bed, glancing around. Later, after checking on Amira and his room, Layla lay down. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was crowded with questions. Who really was Kareem Al at the car floor? Layla couldn't meet Kareem's gaze. He was right, Amir was all that mattered. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, a chill ran down Layla's spine. The place looked more like a palace, with tall iron gates that opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly. Hassan, why was he willing to help? And most importantly, what would be the consequences of her decision? The next morning, a soft knock on the door woke her. It was Amira carrying a tray with breakfast. "The doctor has arrived and is ready to examine Amira," she informed her gently. Layla quickly got dressed and took Amira to the makeshift consultation room on the lower floor. Kareem was already there, speaking with the doctor. He was dressed impeccably in a suit and appeared as composed as he had been the night before. "The doctor is one of the best in the region," Karim said, turning to her. At the car floor, Layla looked away from Karim, unable to meet his gaze. He was right. Amir was all that mattered. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, Layla felt a chill. The place looked more like a palace, with tall iron gates that opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly. "They'll make sure Amira gets the care he needs." Layla felt sad as she watched Karim interact with the doctor. Beneath his serious demeanor, there seemed to be something sincere about his concern. While the doctor examined Amira, Layla noticed Karim observing her. Amir was the only thing that mattered. He looked down at the car floor, unable to meet Karim's gaze. When they arrived at the mansion's gates, Layla felt a chill. The place looked more like a palace. Tall iron gates opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly, discreetly parked cars. He seemed to be studying her, trying to understand more about who she was. Finally, he spoke. "Layla, I know this is all a lot to take in. I want you to know that my offer comes without any hidden motives." She looked at him, trying to gauge the truth in his words. "Then why are you doing this? I still don't understand." Karim paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "Let's just say I've seen people I cared about destroyed by bad choices. I don't want that to happen to you or Amira." Layla felt a chill run through her. Karim's words were sincere. There was something in his tone, a weight, a shadow of pain. She couldn't understand. She decided not to press him. At least not yet. Instead, she focused on Amira, who was smiling as the doctor spoke to him in a friendly tone. Maybe this could be the start of a new life. The sun streamed through the mansion's large windows, bathing everything in a soft light that she couldn't understand. She decided not to pressure him. At least not yet. Instead, she focused on Amira, who was smiling as the doctor spoke to him in a friendly tone. Perhaps this could be the start of a new life. The sun streamed through the mansion's large windows, bathing everything in a soft light that contrasted with the heaviness Layla still felt in her chest. That morning, she watched Amira play in a garden that seemed like a piece of paradise. The perfectly maintained flowers exuded a delicate fragrance. The soft grass made Amira smile, a sight Layla hadn't seen in weeks. Still, she couldn't relax. Everything seemed too. Layla still felt heavy and weighed down. That morning, she watched Amira play in a garden that seemed like a piece of paradise. The flowers were perfectly maintained and exuded a delicate fragrance. The soft grass made Amira smile. It was a sight Layla hadn't seen in weeks. Still, she couldn't relax. Everything seemed too good to be true. "Amira looks happy," a voice said behind her, interrupting her thoughts. Layla turned to see Karim standing on the veranda. He was dressed casually in a white shirt and light trousers, which made him seem less imposing, though he still carried that gaze that seemed to see beyond the surface. "Yes. He is," Layla replied. She was trying to hide her lingering distrust. "He's never had a space like this to play in before." Karim stepped down from the veranda and walked over to her, stopping by her side. "Children deserve a place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here." Layla crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself. "I know you've said that before." She was still suspicious. He was trying to conceal it. Kareem had never had a place like this to play in before. He stepped down from the porch and walked over to her, stopping next to her. Children deserve a place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here. Layla crossed her arms, as if trying to shield herself. I know you've said that before. I still don't understand why you're doing all this. Kareem. It feels like you're carrying something. Something you're trying to make up for. Kareem was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on Amira as the boy chased a butterfly. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am trying to make up for something. It's not just that. Amira reminds me that there's still innocence in the world. Something I'd forgotten. Let's play a little game for those who only read the comments. Type McDonald's in the comments. Only those who've read this far will get it. Now let's continue with the story. Layla was surprised by his honesty there. She tried to hide her lingering distrust. He's never had a space like this to play in before. Kareem stepped down from the veranda and walked over to her, stopping by her side. Children deserve a place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here. Layla crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself. I know you've said that before. Was something in Kareem's eyes that hinted at a deep pain. Something he wasn't ready to fully share. Before she could ask more, a child's voice echoed behind them. Uncle Kareem. Layla turned to see a little girl running toward them. She looked about 6 years old, with dark curls and sparkling eyes. She hesitated when she noticed she tried to hide her uncertainty. He's never had a space like this to play in before. Kareem stepped down from the porch and walked over to her, stopping beside her. Children deserve a place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here. Layla crossed her arms, as if trying to shield herself. I know you've said that before. Layla's mood brightened when she saw Amir. Who is he? She asked, pointing curiously at the boy. This is Amir, Kareem said, smiling gently for the first time. This is my niece, Yasmin said, approaching timidly. Her face soon lit up with a smile. Do you want to play with me? She asked, extending her hand to Amir. He looked at Layla, who nodded encouragingly. In seconds, the two children were running through the garden, laughing together. Layla watched them. She was also curious about Yasmin. She seems very quiet. A child Kareem nodded, his expression shifting to something more serious. Yasmin lost her parents 2 years ago. Since then, I've been. She was still suspicious. He was trying to protect her. Kareem sat down next to her. Children need a safe place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here. Layla crossed her arms, as if she was protecting herself. You've said that before. He was trying to take care of her. She was still sad. Layla felt sad. I'm sorry. That must be hard for her and for you, too. It is, Kareem replied. He didn't give more details. Right now, she seemed happy. At least for a little while. Layla didn't want to push. The way Kareem spoke about Yasmin left. She looked at him, confused. There's more to this than you're telling me. Later, while Amir and Yasmin played under his supervision, Kareem led Layla to a small office in the mansion. The room was decorated with bookshelves filled with books and an elegant dark wood desk. Kareem sat behind it. She tried to hide her continued mistrust. We won't do anything without you. Kareem stepped down from the porch and walked over to her, stopping next to her. Children deserve a place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here. Layla crossed her arms, as if trying to shield herself. I know you've said that before. He gestured for Layla to take the chair in front of him. We need to talk about the next steps. Amir will receive the best medical care. There are other matters we need to consider. Layla frowned. What kind of matters? Education. 1. I'd like to enroll Amir in a private school as soon as he's healthy enough. He deserves a chance to grow up in a better environment. Layla felt a mix of gratitude and apprehension. I appreciate that. I'm not sure it's a good idea. He's already been through so much. Taking him away from what's familiar. Kareem raised a hand, gently interrupting her. I understand. We won't do anything without your permission. Approval. I want you to know that every opportunity will be available to him. Layla didn't know what to say. From the moment she met Kareem, he carried a blend of control and kindness that left her unsettled. It was hard to tell where sincerity ended and pragmatism began. Before she could respond, Kareem stood and walked till he tried to hide his continued mistrust. He had never had a place like this to play in before. Kareem stepped down from the porch and walked over to her, stopping next to her. Children need a place where they can feel free. Amira is safe here. Layla crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself. I know you've said that before. One of the bookshelves. He pulled out an old book with a worn leather cover and placed it on the desk. This belonged to my sister, he said, his voice heavy with nostalgia. She used to read it to Yasmin every night before bed. After she died, Yasmin stopped smiling. It seems Amir managed to change that. Even if just for a moment. Layla ran her hand over the book's cover, feeling the emotional weight it carried. Kareem, I'm so sorry about what happened to your sister. It must be hard raising Yasmin on your own. He nodded, crossing his arms. It's difficult. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready to handle these things. Layla ran her hand over the book's cover, feeling the emotional weight it carried. Kareem, I'm so sorry about what happened to your sister. It must be hard raising Yasmin on your own. He nodded, crossing his arms. It's difficult. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready to handle these things. We just have to keep moving forward. Layla looked at him, realizing that behind his outward strength, Kareem was a man scarred by loss. Maybe Yasmin and Amir can help each other. They seem to be getting along really well. Kareem smiled. A rare and brief gesture. Maybe they're children. Things we just have to keep moving forward. Layla looked at him, realizing that behind his outward strength, Kareem was a man scarred by loss. Maybe Yasmin and Amir can help each other. They seem to be getting along really well. Kareem smiled. A rare and brief gesture. Maybe they're children. After all, they have an incredible ability to connect and heal. Layla held the book a little tighter. The first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this place could become more than a temporary refuge. Maybe it was the beginning of something greater. The mansion was silent, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees in the garden. Layla walked through the hallways after putting Amir to bed. The boy was calmer than he had been in months. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small sense of she felt relieved. Her mind was still full of doubts and questions about everything she had discovered since she arrived at the house. Without realizing it, her steps led her to the library. The room was very big, with endless rows of books. The books seemed to hold centuries of stories and secrets. Layla felt drawn to the space. As if some invisible force had guided her there. She began browsing the books on the shelves. Something on one of the walls caught her attention. It was a framed photograph. Layla approached slowly. Her eyes widening as she recognized one of the people in the photograph. In the picture. Her mother. She blinked. Thinking she might be imagining things. There was no doubt. The woman in the photo was Rania. Her mother. She looked younger. With a faint smile. Standing next to another woman. A refined young lady with delicate features and a gold crescent moon necklace. Layla froze for a few seconds. Trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Why would a photo of her mother be in Kareem's library? And who was the woman standing beside her? Before she could process it all. A voice came from behind her. Low yet laced with tension. Layla. What are you doing here? She turned quickly to see Kareem standing in the doorway. His expression was difficult to understand. I was exploring, she said. Hesitantly. But then I saw this. She pointed to the photograph. Kareem walked slowly toward her. His eyes looking at the image. When he stopped beside Layla. His expression changed a little. It was as though something about the photo bothered him. Who are the women in this picture? Layla asked. Trying to speak calmly. Even though her heart was beating very fast. Kareem paused for a short time. He quickly responded. Seeming calm. The young woman on the right is my sister. Soraya. He pointed to the woman wearing the crescent moon necklace. The other one. I don't know. She must have been someone who worked here. Layla felt her chest tighten. He didn't know. How was that possible, she asked. Waiting for a reaction. That woman is my mother, she said. Waiting for a reaction. Kareem raised an eyebrow in surprise. Your mother. Are you sure? Yes, Layla insisted. Holding his gaze. I would recognize my mother anywhere. Kareem remained silent. Shifting his eyes back to the photograph. He seemed to analyze the. He looked closer at the photo. His stiff posture showed that he was uncomfortable. I don't remember her. He finally said. His tone was careful. I'm not sure if your mother worked here. Layla wasn't sure what to think. Something about Kareem's behavior felt strange. Was he lying? If he was lying, why? Later that night. Layla couldn't sleep. Her mother's face in the photograph kept flashing in her mind. Along with Kareem's words. Something didn't add up. He clearly knew more than he was letting on. Determined to uncover the truth. Layla decided to investigate. Layla knew that Amira, the housekeeper, had worked at the mansion for many years and might be able to answer her questions. The next morning, Layla found Amira in the kitchen. Helping with breakfast. Amira. Layla began. Trying to sound casual, can I ask you something? Of course. Dear. What do you need to know? Amira replied with a warm smile. My mother. Rania. I think she worked here in the past. Do you remember her? Amira looked surprised by the question but quickly nodded. Rania. Oh yes. I remember her. She worked here for many years. Back when Soraya was alive. She was such a sweet and hard-working person. Working woman. A chill ran down Layla's spine. Do you know what she did here? She was one of Soraya's caregivers. Amira explained that they were very close. Almost like sisters. I think Soraya trusted her more than anyone else. Amira's words confirmed Layla's suspicions. Her mother not only knew Soraya, they were close. This made people ask even more questions. Why didn't her mother ever tell her about it? Why did Karim lie and say he knew her? Later, while Karim was at a meeting, Layla went back to the library. This time, she was determined to find the answers. She started looking through the books and papers on the shelves near the photograph. After a few minutes, she found a small notebook with a worn cover and the letters S.A. engraved on the front. As she opened the notebook, Layla realized it was a journal. The pages were filled with Soraya's elegant handwriting. As she read, Layla found several mentions of her mother. Rania. Rania is the only person I can trust. She always knows how to make me feel better, that I don't know what I would do without her. Today, Rania and I talked about the future. She said she sometimes feels like she needs to leave. I don't want her to go. She's like a sister to me. Layla kept reading. Growing more and more intrigued, the journal revealed a deep bond between Soraya and Rania. It also mentioned problems in the family. Karim and their father didn't like the closeness between the two of them. Why father said Rania is interfering where she doesn't belong. He doesn't understand, she means everything to me. Layla felt a wave of emotion as she read. Her mother had been she was a big deal in Soraya's life. Something went wrong that evening. During dinner, Layla decided to confront Karim again. Amira told me that my mother worked here, she started without hesitation. She was very close to your sister Soraya. Why didn't you tell me that before? Karim put his utensils down on the table, and Layla was a significant figure in Soraya's life. Something must have gone wrong that evening during dinner. Layla decided to confront Karim again. Amira told me that my mother worked here. She began without hesitation. She was very close to your sister Soraya. Why didn't you tell me that before? Karim set his utensils down on the table and looked at her with a serious expression. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Layla. Even if I had, I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant? Layla said incredulously. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Karim sighed, averting his gaze. He looked at her seriously. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Even if I had, I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant? Layla said, surprised. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Karim sighed, averting his gaze. Perhaps I underestimated its importance. But if you want to know more, I promise to help you investigate. Layla could tell he was still hiding something. She decided to hold back for now. She knew the truth was there, waiting to be uncovered. She was determined to find it, no matter what it took. Layla was resolute. Since she learned that her mother, Rania, had worked at Karim's mansion for years, that her presence there was more than a coincidence. Her mind had been racing, there was a mystery to solve. Layla knew that to protect Amir and understand the connection to Karim's family, she needed to uncover the whole truth. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Layla. Even if I had, I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant, Layla said, incredulous. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Karim sighed, averting his eyes. After the tense dinner with Karim, Layla returned to the library the next day. Soraya's journal, which she had found earlier, was her main clue. Layla needed to examine every detail of the notebook. Convinced that it held critical answers about what had happened between her mother and Kareem's sister. She sat at the oak table. Carefully opening the journal. Soraya's words seemed to leap off the pages. As Layla read, the emotions of the young woman became clear. Soraya was lonely. Constrained by her family's rigid expectations. Saw Rania as a source of comfort. Rania is the only person who understands me. One entry read. She listens to me. He looked at her seriously. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Layla. Even if I had. I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant, Layla said. Surprised. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Kareem sighed. Averting his gaze. She never judges me. Unlike my father or even Kareem. It's as if she's my real sister. The further Layla read, the darker Soraya's words became. One passage made her stop. Her heart racing. Today. My father said that Rania needs to leave. He thinks her presence is a bad influence. He doesn't understand how important. He looked at her seriously. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Even if I had. I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant? Layla said incredulously. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Kareem sighed. Averting his gaze. She is to me. I don't know what I'll do if she goes. Layla swallowed hard. This confirmed that something had happened between her mother and Kareem's family. The question was why. That afternoon, while Amir and Yasmin played in the garden, Layla decided to seek out Amira again. The housekeeper seemed like a reliable source of information. Layla knew she needed to dig deeper. Amira was in the main hall, adjusting a vase of flowers. When she saw Layla approaching, she gave her a warm smile. Is something wrong? Dear. Amira began hesitantly. Do you know why my mother stopped working here? What happened to make her leave? Amir looked surprised by the question. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Even if I had. I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant. Layla said incredulously. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Kareem sighed. Averting his gaze and pausing to think for a moment. Ah. Well. It was all very complicated. I remember Rania being very close to Soraya. As you already know. They were inseparable. But one day, Kareem's father decided it was better for Rania to leave. Layla frowned. Why? What did he have against my mother? Amira sighed. Mr. Al-Hassan was a very strict man that he didn't think it was good for Soraya to form close bonds with someone outside the family. Especially someone who worked for them. He also thought that Rania was interfering too much in Soraya's life. Layla stood silent. Thinking about the information. Didn't say anything. Did he fire her? Was there more to it? I don't know all the details. Amir admitted. I remember Rania left suddenly. Soraya was devastated after that. Soraya was never the same. Amir's words hung in the air. Heavy with meaning, Layla felt a mix of sadness and anger. Her mother had never mentioned any of this. It was clear that the incident had left deep scars on both Rania and Soraya. Later. Kareem, he looked at her with a serious expression. I didn't know your mother was the same person in the photo. Layla. Even if I had. I didn't think it was relevant. Not relevant, Layla said incredulously. My mother spent years in this house. She was practically a sister to Soraya. How could that not be relevant? Kareem sighed. Averting his eyes. He returned from one of his meetings. He looked tired. Layla decided it was the right time to confront him. She found him in his office, reviewing some papers. When he saw Layla enter, he raised an eyebrow. Surprised. You've been very curious lately, he remarked with a slight smile. Layla wasn't in the mood for small talk. Kareem. I need to know the truth about my mother, he said directly. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I've already told you what I know. Layla. Your mother worked here. I don't have many details. That's not true, she retorted, feeling her frustration rise. You knew my mother was important to Soraya. You knew she was sent away on purpose. Kareem was silent for a moment, his expression growing more serious. Finally, he sighed. You're right. I knew Rania was important to Soraya. What you need to understand is that my father was a controlling man. He believed he was protecting Soraya by making your mother leave. Was protecting her from something? Layla asked, her voice trembling. Was my mother a threat? Kareem shook his head. No. My father was afraid that Soraya would be influenced by Rania to make rebellious decisions. She always wanted to be in charge of us. Layla felt tears forming in her eyes but stopped them. My mother was fired because your father thought she was giving your sister too much freedom. Kareem nodded. That's exactly what happened. Layla. You need to understand. Soraya was devastated. She tried to fight my father. He wouldn't stop. You? Layla asked, staring at him. What did you do? Kareem. He looked away, looking ashamed. I was young at the time. I didn't know how to stand up to my father. I did what he told me. Like I always had. Layla felt disappointed. She understood that Kareem had also been a victim of his father's control. She couldn't help but wonder how things might have been different if he had supported her mother and Soraya. That night, Layla returned to the library. She sat at the desk and opened Soraya's diary again. There was one entry she hadn't read yet. Her hands trembled as she turned the page. Today was the worst day of my life. My father sent Rania away. I begged and cried. He wouldn't change his mind. He said it was for my own good. He doesn't understand. Rania was the only person who made me feel free. Now I feel alone again. I don't know how I'll cope. Layla closed the diary was in her hands. Tears were streaming down her face. Her mother had been a light in Soraya's life. That light was taken away by Kareem's father's cruel control. Now, decades later, that story was still affecting Layla and Amir's lives. There was more. Layla felt that she still didn't know the full truth. There was a missing piece to this puzzle. Something that tied her mother to the mansion. She was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, Layla was worried. Pieces of her mother Rania's past were coming together. There were also gaps. This made her question everything. Something important had happened in that house decades ago. The truth felt closer than ever. Determined, Layla returned to the library. It was the place where fragments of the past after spending hours searching through old records and forgotten notebooks. Layla found an envelope hidden among the books on one of the highest shelves. It was small. Sealed with wax. Had Soraya's handwriting on the back. Layla carefully opened the envelope and found a letter addressed to Rania. It was written by Kareem's father, Mr. Al-Hassan. As she read the first lines, she felt shocked. The letter made it clear that her mother had been having a secret relationship with Kareem's father. The words were intense and emotional, revealing a relationship that had been hidden from everyone. Dear Rania, I know that what we have cannot be shared with the world. You make my darkest days better. Despite the challenges, I cannot stay away from you. All I ask is that you trust me. Always. Layla read and reread the letter. Her hands trembled. How could this be possible? Her mother had never mentioned anything about a relationship with Kareem's father. This explained so much. It explained why she had been abruptly dismissed. It explained why Kareem's father had been so determined to separate her from Soraya. It was a scandal the Al-Hassan family would never let the truth come out. Later, Layla sat in the garden, still trying to understand her discovery. She held the letter as if it were a piece of her own stolen history. What else did Kareem know? Could he have been hiding something this significant from her? When Kareem returned to the mansion that afternoon, Layla decided it was time to confront him. She found him in his office. As usual, reviewing documents. He heard the door open and looked up. His expression immediately changed when he saw the look on her face. We need to talk, Layla said firmly. Of course, Kareem replied, setting his papers aside. What's wrong? Layla asked, looking directly into his eyes. Did you know about this? Kareem picked up the letter carefully, reading it quickly. When he finished, he let out a deep sigh and ran a hand over his face. Yes, he admitted finally. Layla stepped closer, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. You knew. You knew my mother had an affair with your father and didn't tell me. Kareem placed the letter back on the desk, meeting her gaze. I felt guilty and determined. I knew about the affair. Layla. I didn't know you were Rania's daughter. I only realized it when you told me her name. Even then, you lied to me. Layla accused her, her voice rising. You knew my mother was unfairly dismissed because of her relationship with your father. You chose to keep it from me. Why? Kareem stood and walked toward the window, his movements deliberate as though he was carefully considering his response. Finally he spoke. I didn't want to hurt you. Hurt me? Layla let out a bitter laugh. You thought hiding this from me was the best way to protect me. Don't you think I had the right to know the truth about my mother? Yes. You did. Kareem said, turning to face her. I knew that truth would be painful. Your mother was a wonderful woman. Layla. She didn't deserve what happened to her. My father put her in an impossible position. He was married. Powerful. When everything spiraled out of control, he discarded her to protect the family's reputation. His words only fueled Layla's anger and pain. You did nothing, she said, crossing her arms. You knew all of this and let it happen. You let my mother be treated like she was nothing. Kareem closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to absorb the weight of her accusations. That I was young Layla. I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced the consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. But you have power now. Yet, You have power now. Yet you chose to deceive me. To pretend you didn't know anything. Why? Kareem, why didn't you tell me from the start? Kareem stepped closer to her. His expression filled with guilt. Because I didn't want you to carry the burden of what happened between your mother and my father. That I didn't want you to believe that her life was defined by young Layla. I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. But you have power now. Yet. That relationship. It was Layla. She said, her voice breaking. She lost everything because of him. I grew up knowing nothing about it. The silence that followed was heavy. Kareem had no more answers. Layla felt tears streaming down her face. It was too much to process. Too much to bear. I just wanted to protect you. Kareem. Young Layla, I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. You have power now. Yet, he said, his voice low. I understand if you can't forgive me. Layla stared at him for a moment, trying to decide how she felt. Part of her wanted to scream and blame Kareem for everything. But at the same time, she knew he had been a victim of his father's control as well. He had failed to protect her and Rania. He wasn't the young Layla. I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. True culprit, I don't know if I can trust you again. She said firmly. I know I need to uncover the whole truth. I'll do it with or without your help. Kerm nodded, respecting her determination. I'll help you. Layla. I promise I won't hide anything anymore. Layla didn't reply. She simply took the letter from the desk and left. Young Layla didn't know how to stand up to her father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. You have power now. Yet. The office left Kerm alone with his guilt. She knew this was only the beginning. Her mother's past was closer to being uncovered. Layla felt that the answers she sought might change everything forever. The days that followed saw Layla and Kerm spending more time together than ever. Since their confrontation about Rania's, Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. Past and her affair with Kerm's father, the two had grown unexpectedly closer. Kerm began to show a more vulnerable side, sharing fragments of his life that had long been buried under his facade of control and power. Layla, on the other hand, felt torn. On one side, she was still struggling to fully trust him. On the other, she was. Young Layla didn't know how to stand up to her father. He was a cruel man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I couldn't change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. You have power now. Yet. You're starting to see a more human side of Kerm, a side she hadn't expected to find. On a sunny afternoon, Layla was in Amir's room, helping him put together a puzzle. He laughed as he fit the final piece, filling her heart with joy. Taking care of Amir always gave her a sense of purpose, even amidst the emotional turmoil she was going through. Young Layla, I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. Through, are you having fun, my love? She asked, stroking his hair gently. Yes, Mommy, Amir replied with a smile, his eyes sparkling with happiness. Layla hugged him, cherishing the purity of the moment. Amir was her priority, her anchor in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Despite the revelations about her mother. What truly young Layla, I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. But what mattered to Layla was ensuring Amir's future. Later that same day, Layla went to the office where Kareem was reviewing paperwork. He seemed focused. When he saw her enter, a soft smile appeared on his face. Is everything all right? He asked, setting the papers aside. Layla sat in a chair across from his desk. I'm just thinking about young Layla, I didn't know how to stand up to my father. He was a ruthless man. Anyone who defied him faced consequences. I'm not trying to justify what happened. I'm just saying that at the time, I didn't have the power to change anything. Layla shook her head, unable to accept his excuses. You have power now. Yet, everything. It feels like my life has been turned upside down since I got here. Kareem leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking on hers. I know how that feels. Sometimes it seems like the weight of the past never leaves us. Does it? Layla nodded. Yes. What amazes me the most is how you've managed to carry all of this. Losing your sister. Your father's control. It must have been so hard. Kareem sighed, glancing away for a moment. It was. In some ways. It shaped who I am. I learned to bury my pain and move forward. Even when it felt impossible. I admire that. Layla said, not realizing her words carried more emotion than she had intended. Kareem smiled faintly. There was something deeper in his expression. Something Layla couldn't immediately identify. He stood and walked over to her, stopping beside her chair. Layla, I have to say something to you. I'm not sure how. I've started to feel something for you over the past few days. But there was something more to his expression. Something Layla couldn't immediately identify. He stood and walked over to her, stopping beside her chair. Layla, he began, his voice softer now. I don't know how to say this without it sounding wrong. Over the past few days, I've started to feel something for you. Something that goes beyond admiration. Layla was speechless. Before she could respond, Kareem leaned in and kissed her softly. It was a brief moment. It was filled with intensity, leaving Layla breathless. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with sincerity. I admire your strength. He said. Something for you. Something beyond admiration. Layla was speechless. Before she could respond, Kareem leaned in and kissed her softly. It was a brief moment. It was filled with intensity, leaving Layla breathless. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with sincerity. I admire your strength. Your determination. Honestly, I think I'm falling in love with you. Layla remained silent, unable to organize her thoughts. Finally, she murmured, I don't know what to say. Kareem nodded, respecting her hesitation. You don't have to say anything right now. I just wanted you to know. In the nights that followed, Layla found herself thinking more and more about Kareem. The kiss had left her confused. It had also awakened something inside her. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on a mirror. At night, when she was alone, she couldn't help it. Finally, she admitted to herself that she was falling in love with Kareem. Kareem made Layla feel things she had never felt before. He was both strong and vulnerable. She could no longer ignore how much he had come to mean to her. A few days later, Kareem was in his office organizing some old papers. He remembered drawers he hadn't opened in years. He was in love with him. 2. Kareem made her feel things she had never felt before. He was both strong and vulnerable. Layla could no longer ignore how much he had come to mean to her. A few days later, Kareem was in his office organizing some old papers. He remembered drawers he hadn't opened in years, filled with things from his father's time. While sifting through the documents, he found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside were old letters. He picked one up and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. I'm pregnant, the letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear. Kareem was sifting through his father's old documents when he found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside were old letters. He picked up one and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. I'm pregnant. The letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Rania explained that she was expecting a child with Kareem's father and was asking for financial help for treatments during her pregnancy. Kareem read and reread the letter, trying to absorb what he was discovering. That wasn't all. There was another letter, dated shortly after the Kareem was sifting through his father's old documents when he found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside were old letters. He picked up one and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. I'm pregnant. The letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear. First, I won't terminate the pregnancy. I've decided to leave and raise my child on my own. I know you'll never accept her. I don't care. She will be my joy, my reason to live. Kareem felt as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Layla was Rania's daughter. Now he realized that her father Kareem was sifting through his father's old documents when he found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside, he found old letters. He picked up one and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. I'm pregnant, the letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear. Was it also his father? Later, Kareem found Layla in the garden. She was sitting on a bench, watching Yasmin play. When she saw the expression on Kareem's face, she knew something was wrong. What is it? She asked. Worried, Kareem sat beside her, holding the letters he had found. He hesitated, for Kareem was sifting through his father's old documents when he found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside, he found old letters. He picked up one and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. "I'm pregnant," the letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear. Moment before handing them to Layla, he said, "You need to read this." Layla took the letters and began reading. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to absolute shock. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "This means that you're my sister," Kareem said, finishing her sentence. Kareem found an old letter from Rania, Layla's mother. While looking through his father's old papers, the letter said, "I'm pregnant." Kareem felt like the ground was moving away from under him. "Rania's daughter with my father?" Layla said, her hands on her face. "This can't be true. It can't be." "I didn't want to believe it either," Kareem said, his voice full of emotion. "But these letters prove everything. My father knew and did nothing. He let your mother." He found a wooden box at the back of a drawer, inside of which were old letters. He picked one up and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. "I'm pregnant," the letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear. "Leave and pretend you didn't exist." Layla shook her head, struggling to process the revelation. But what devastated her even more was what she felt for Kareem. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Kareem lowered his head, clearly battling his own emotions. "I don't know what to do either. Layla. I know. One thing, I fell in love with you. Now I've discovered that you're my sister." The silence between them was unbearable. Both were devastated, crushed by the truth that united and separated them at the same time. A heavy stillness hung over the mansion like a dark shadow. Since the heartbreaking discovery. While looking through his father's old things, Kareem found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside were old letters. He picked up one and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. The letter began, "I'm pregnant." And Kareem felt the ground disappear. They were siblings. Layla and Kareem could barely look at each other. What had once been a growing bond, filled with tender moments, had turned into an unbearable tension. Both were grappling with a whirlwind of emotions that seemed to have no escape. Layla spent most of her time with Amir, trying. He was sifting through his father's old documents when he found a wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside were old letters. He picked up one and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Rania, Layla's mother. "I'm pregnant," the letter began. Kareem felt the ground disappear. She knew she needed to be strong for her son. Her heart was in pieces. Every time she thought about the kiss, about the closeness they had shared, the pain grew. She loved him, not as a brother. One afternoon, while Amir was napping, Layla sat in her. Kareem was looking at the open suitcase on her bed. She had made a decision. She wasn't sure how to follow through with it. Every moment spent with Kareem made her feel more and more overwhelmed. "Let's play a little game. Those who only read the comments, type Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who've read this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story." There was a soft knock at the door. Layla knew who it was even before she opened it. Kareem stood there, his face tired and worn. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. He's here, Layla said, nodding and opening the door wider for him to enter. Kareem closed the door behind him and stood in silence for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Layla, he began finally. I know this is impossible. I want to forget what happened between us before we knew the truth. I can't. I wish things were different. Layla turned away, crying. I wish things were different, too. Kareem. We can't change who we are. You're my brother. Saying these words was painful. You could see the pain on Kareem's face. He ran a hand through his hair, showing that he was frustrated and desperate. He said, his voice was barely a whisper. Knowing doesn't make these feelings go away. It doesn't make what I feel for you go away. Finally, Layla looked at him. Her eyes were filled with tears. That's exactly why I need to leave. Kareem stared at her, unable to believe it. Leave? To where? He asked. Because I can't stay here, she said, her voice trembling. I've tried, he said. But every time I look at you, I feel something. I shouldn't feel like I love you. Not like a sister. That's wrong. I can't stay here any longer. Layla. Please don't do this. Kareem pleaded, taking a step toward her. I know this is confusing. We can get through this together. We can find a way to deal with this. Layla shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. We can't. Kareem. Not when the feelings are this strong. I have to leave. It's the only way. Layla was careful to protect herself. The next morning, she began packing her things. Amir noticed the commotion and asked what was happening. Layla explained vaguely that she needed to leave. She didn't give any details. When she finished packing her suitcase, she went to Amir's room. He was sitting on the floor playing with a toy car that Kareem had given him. Layla knelt beside her son, placing a hand on his shoulder. Amir. We're leaving today, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Amir looked at her, confused. But why? Mommy? I like it here. Uncle Kareem. Layla felt her heart tighten. I know. My love, she said. But it's time for us to go somewhere else. We're going to start a new life. Just the two of us. All right, Amir nodded. The look in his eyes showed that he didn't fully understand. Layla hugged him tightly. She smelled his hair, which she knew well. Tried not to cry. When Layla came down the stairs with Amir and her suitcase, Kareem was waiting for her in the hall. He looked upset. He stayed calm. He was clearly trying to respect her decision. This is it, he said, his voice rough. Layla nodded. Did not look at him. It's what's best for all of us, Kareem said, stepping closer to Layla. I don't want you to go. If you really need to, I won't stop you. Just promise me one thing. Layla finally looked at him, surprised. What is it? Promise me you'll reach out if you ever need anything. Anything. Layla. No matter where you are or how much time has passed. Layla felt the tears threatening to spill again. She managed to nod. I promise. In the days following Layla's departure, Kareem. He tried hard to stop thinking about her and focus on work. He couldn't stop. He kept thinking about every moment they had spent together. He remembered the first day she walked into his life, knowing she was his sister. At the same time, the woman he had fallen in love with. It was very hard to deal with. He spent hours in his office looking at the documents and letters that had uncovered the truth. One night, as he was read the letter where Rania tells Karim's father she's pregnant, he notices something he missed before, a name mentioned in passing. "My daughter will be named Layla," the letter says. Karim squints as he reads the words again. He knows Layla is his sister. Every line of the letter confirms what he already knew. He's having a hard time accepting it. Meanwhile, Layla and Amir were staying in a small inn in the city. Layla spent her nights staring at the ceiling, thinking about Karim. She knew that leaving had been the right decision. It didn't make the pain any easier to bear. One night, while Amir was sleeping, Layla took out her mother's necklace, which she always kept tucked away. She ran her fingers over the crescent moon shaped pendant, remembering Rania's words on her deathbed. "I always wished you had a sister so you wouldn't be alone." Layla closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the irony. Her mother had wanted her to have a sister. Instead, she had fallen in love with her brothers. "I need to move on," she whispered to herself. "Me and for Amir." Deep down, she knew that forgetting Karim would be nearly impossible. Layla woke up to the sound of Amir crying softly beside her. When she placed her hand on his forehead, she felt the intense heat of a high fever. Her heart raced as she quickly picked him up. He was pale. His small body trembled. "Amir. My love. Everything's going to be okay," she said, trying to calm him down while reaching for her phone to call a taxi. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Layla held Amir in her arms, murmuring desperate prayers as tears streamed down her face. When they arrived, she quickly explained the situation to the receptionist, who called for a doctor. Amir was taken in for an examination, left Layla feeling helpless in the waiting room. Karim was in his office, lost in thought, as he often was since Layla had left. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was Amir, who had heard about Amir from one of Layla's friends. "Karim. Amir," she said urgently. "Amir is in the hospital. Layla took him there this morning." Karim learned that Amir was very sick. He didn't hesitate to grab his car keys and leave immediately. The thought of Layla facing this alone was unbearable. When he arrived at the hospital, he found her sitting alone in a corner of the waiting room. Her eyes were red. Her face showed worry and exhaustion. When she saw him, her expression. This morning, Karim was very sick. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his car keys and left immediately. The thought of Layla facing this alone was unbearable. When he arrived at the hospital, Karim found Layla sitting in a corner of the waiting room. Her eyes were red. Her face showed worry and exhaustion. When she saw him, her expression shifted to one of surprise and then relief. "What are you doing here?" she murmured. "Amir told me he was here," Karim replied. "I couldn't stay away." "How is Amir?" Layla shook her head, trying to hold back tears. "I don't know yet. They're running tests." Karim placed a hand on her shoulder. This was a gesture that spoke volumes without words. He would stay by her side no matter what happened. After some time, the doctor returned. Layla stood immediately, holding her breath. "Your son is stable now," the doctor said, with a reassuring smile. The fever was caused by a viral infection. We've managed to bring it under control. He'll need rest and plenty of fluids. He'll need fluids. He'll be fine. Layla breathed a sigh of relief. Covered her face with her hands. Wept. Kareem helped her back into her seat. Placed a comforting hand on her back. Said gently. He's going to be fine. She nodded. Trying to regain her composure after Amir was discharged. Brought him back home. Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed. She needed a break. Even if just for a few minutes. As they sipped their coffee in silence. Kareem finally broke the ice. Layla. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. Layla looked confused. What do you mean? I want to give you half of my money. Layla almost dropped her coffee cup. What? No, I can't accept that. You can. You will. He insisted. You deserve it. Your mother suffered so much because of my father. I feel like this is the least I can do to make up for his mistakes. No, Layla shook her head. Tears starting to stream down her face again. You don't have to do this. I don't want your money. This isn't about money, Kareem replied. Holding her hand. It's about giving you what you deserve. You can't refuse. She looked at him for a long moment and finally nodded. Still reluctant. A few days later. While sorting through his late father's old office. Kareem found something that would change his life forever. As he looked through the drawers. He found an envelope marked, confidential. Inside was an adoption document. He read it. Feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. He wasn't biologically related to the Al Hassan family. He was adopted. The words swirled in his mind. This means. I'm not Layla's brother. Kareem didn't know how to react. Part of him was devastated. To discover that his entire life had been built on a lie. Another part of him felt a wave of relief and hope. He wasn't Layla's brother. The love he felt for Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed because she needed a break. Even if it was just for a few minutes. As they sipped their coffee in silence. Kareem finally spoke. Layla. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. He wasn't wrong, Kareem said. Kareem went straight to the house where Layla was staying. She opened the door. Surprised to see him there so late. What happened? She asked. Concerned by the expression on his face. I found something, Kareem began. Taking a deep breath. It changes everything. She frowned. Confused. What do you mean? Kareem stepped inside and handed her the document. Layla read it slowly. Her expression shifting from confusion to utter shock. You were adopted? She asked. Her voice barely a whisper. Kareem nodded. His eyes fixed on hers. That I'm not biologically related to my father. That means we're not siblings. Layla let the paper fall to the floor. Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed. She needed a break. Even if just for a few minutes. As they sipped their coffee in silence. Kareem finally spoke. Layla. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. Floor's hands flew to her mouth. The revelation was almost too much to process. Everything she had felt. All the pain of being in love with someone she thought was her brother. Now seemed to unravel. So. We're not siblings, she said. Barely able to believe the words she was speaking. Kareem took a step closer to her. His expression. Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed because she needed a break. Even if it was just for a few minutes. As they drank their coffee in silence, Kareem finally spoke. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. Still shaken but full of emotion, Layla replied. I know this doesn't erase what happened. It does mean that what we feel is not wrong. Layla looked at him for a long moment before finally stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. Kareem held her tightly, pulling her close. I don't know what to do with all of this, she said. Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed because she needed a break. Even if it was just for a few minutes. As they sipped their coffee in silence, Kareem finally spoke. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. Crying. But I'm so relieved. I'm relieved that we don't have to be apart. Kareem held her even tighter, feeling the weight of the past week start to lift. Me too. The days following the revelation that Kareem was adopted were a mix of relief and rebuilding for Layla and Kareem. Knowing they weren't siblings changed everything. Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed because she needed a break. Even if it was just for a few minutes. As they drank their coffee in silence, Kareem finally spoke up. Layla. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. It didn't erase the challenges they still faced. Layla carried the pain of everything she had learned about her mother and the past. Kareem, on the other hand, now questioned his identity. Who were his biological parents? Why was he adopted? These questions lingered in his mind. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in facing them. Kareem invited Layla to have coffee with him. She hesitated. Eventually agreed because she needed a break. Even if it was just for a few minutes. As they drank their coffee in silence, Kareem finally started talking. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I want to do something for you and Amir. Meanwhile, Layla sat in the garden of the inn and watched Amir and Yasmin play. The two of them laughed as they ran around a small fountain, their joy filling the air. Kareem approached quietly, observing the scene for a few moments before sitting beside Layla on the wooden bench. You look more at peace, he said, sitting down next to her. She smiled a little. I'm trying. After everything that's happened, I think I can finally breathe a little. Kareem nodded. His expression showed a mix of worry and determination. Layla. I've been thinking a lot these past few days about you. Amir. Us. She turned to him, her heart beating faster. Since they had discovered. She smiled slightly. I'm trying. After everything that had happened, she thought she could finally breathe a little. Kareem nodded. There was something in his expression, a mix of worry and determination. I've been thinking a lot these past few days about you. Amir. Us. She turned to him, her heart beating faster. Since they had discovered they weren't siblings, she knew this conversation would come. She hadn't been sure how to begin it. What are you thinking? She asked softly. Kareem took a deep breath, looking at her with a sincerity that left her speechless. I don't want to waste any more time. I've spent my entire life trying to fix my father's mistakes. Now I realize the only thing. They weren't siblings. Layla knew this conversation would come. She hadn't been sure how to begin it. What are you thinking? She asked softly. Kareem took a deep breath, looking at her with a sincerity that left her disarmed. I don't want to waste any more time. I've spent my entire life trying to fix my father's mistakes. Now I realize the only thing that truly matters is the present. I love you, Layla. I love you, Amir. I want us to be together. Layla was silent. His words echoed in her mind. She knew how she felt about Kareem. She also knew how complicated everything still was. Finally, she replied, Kareem. I love you, too. We still have so much to work through. You're still dealing with the present is all that matters. I love you, Layla. I love you, Amir. I want us to be together. Layla was silent. His words echoed in her mind. She knew how she felt about Kareem. She also knew how complicated everything still was. Finally, she replied, Kareem. I love you too. We still have so much to work through. You're still dealing with the truth about your adoption. I'm still trying to process everything I've learned about my mother. I just don't want us to make decisions in the heat of the moment. Kareem took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. I understand, Layla. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. I just want you to know that I'm here. No matter what happens. Layla felt tears. Her eyes showed she was happy. This time the tears she shed were from relief. She squeezed his hand, finding comfort in his words. In the days that followed, Kareem began investigating his adoption. He hired a private investigator to help him trace any information about his biological parents. Layla supported him, even though she knew the process would be challenging. Her eyes showed her pain. This time they were tears of relief. She squeezed his hand, finding comfort in his words. In the days that followed, Kareem began investigating his adoption. He hired a private investigator to help find any information about his biological parents. Layla supported him, even though she knew the process would be challenging. Meanwhile, they started building a new routine together. Kareem spent more time with Amir, playing with him in the garden or reading bedtime stories. Layla watched these moments with a heart full of gratitude. Amir was finally living the childhood he deserved, surrounded by love and care. One evening, as Layla was tucking Amir into bed, Kareem entered the room quietly. He watched as she kissed Amir's forehead and turned off the light when she turned around. Kareem smiled. You're amazing with him, he said, admiring her. He's my world. I'd do anything for him. Layla replied with a smile. I know. And I want to be part of that world. Layla said. Not just as someone passing through. As someone who's by your side. Well up in her eyes. This time they were tears of relief. She squeezed his hand, finding comfort in his words. In the days that followed, Kareem began investigating his adoption. He hired a private investigator to help trace any information about his biological parents. Layla supported him, even though she knew the process would be challenging. Meanwhile, Layla felt her heart warm at his words. A few weeks later, the private investigator Kareem had hired returned with surprising information. He discovered that Kareem's biological parents were a humble couple who couldn't afford to raise him. They had left Kareem at an orphanage when he was just a baby. Kareem's adoptive father, Mr. Al, her eyes showed her relief. She squeezed his hand, finding comfort in his words. In the days that followed, Kareem began investigating his adoption. He hired a private investigator to help trace any information about his biological parents. Layla supported him, even though she knew the process would be challenging. Meanwhile, Hassan had adopted him after visiting the orphanage as part of a charity event. So they left me because they couldn't take care of me, Kareem said to Layla as they reviewed the investigator's documents. That doesn't change who you are, Layla said, holding his hand. You're strong, generous, incredible. None of that depends on who your biological parents were. Kareem smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. You're the reason I keep feeling that way. A month later, on a quiet evening, Kareem prepared a special dinner for Layla in the mansion's garden. Under the soft lights hanging from the trees, he looked into her eyes and held her hands. Layla, I know we've been through so much. We're still getting back on our feet. I can't imagine my life without you and Amir. He took a deep breath before continuing. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Layla, will you marry me? Tears streamed down Layla's face. She had never imagined she would find someone like Kareem. Someone who not only accepted her completely, also fought to be a. Her eyes showed her relief. She squeezed his hand, finding comfort in his words. In the days that followed, Kareem began investigating his adoption. He hired a private investigator to help trace any information about his biological parents. Layla supported him, even though she knew the process would be challenging. Meanwhile, part of her life. Yes, she replied with a radiant smile. Yes, I'll marry you. Kareem smiled and pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the weight of everything they had endured finally lift. A few months later, the wedding day finally arrived. Kareem had arranged for the ceremony to take place in the mansion's gardens, transforming the space into a dream world. Her eyes welled up with tears. This time they were tears of relief. She squeezed his hand, finding comfort in his words. In the days that followed, Kareem began investigating his adoption. He hired a private investigator to help trace any information about his biological parents. Layla supported him, even though she knew the process would be challenging. Meanwhile, the trees were adorned with twinkling lights and rows of white chairs surrounded an altar draped in flowers. Amir and Yasmin ran around excitedly, helping Amira with the final touches. Layla was in her room, adjusting her dress. It was a simple yet elegant design that seemed made just for her. Her hair was styled in a delicate bun with a few loose strands framing her face softly. She looked at herself in the mirror and smiled, reflecting on how unexpectedly her life had changed. As the music began to play, Layla walked down the aisle, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. Her eyes stayed fixed on Kareem, who stood waiting for her at the altar. His face showed his emotions. He wore a perfect suit. What stood out the most was the brightness in his eyes, a light that only existed because of her. When they finally met at the altar, Kareem took her hands and whispered, "You look stunning." Layla smiled, holding back tears, said, "You look incredible." During their vows, Kareem promised Layla that he would care for her. Amir was devoted to Layla. He did everything to make her feel loved and protected. Layla spoke about how Kareem had transformed her life. She said he was the man she never thought she would find. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Kareem leaned in and kissed Layla. The guests applauded. Amir and Yasmin ran up to hug them, completing the perfect moment. Every day, Amir made sure that Layla felt loved and protected. Layla said that Kareem had changed her life and that he was the man she never thought she would find. When the officiant said, "I do," Kareem kissed Layla. The guests clapped. Amir and Yasmin hugged them. That evening, after the celebration, Layla and Kareem were alone in their room. They enjoyed the quiet after such an emotional day. Layla held Kareem's hands as they laughed about funny moments from the ceremony. Kareem looked nervous and happy. "What is it?" he asked. "Worried. I wanted to tell you this earlier. I thought the wedding would," Layla said, taking a deep breath. Evening after the celebration, Layla and Kareem were alone in their room, enjoying the quiet after such an emotional day. Layla held Kareem's hands as they laughed about funny little moments from the ceremony. Kareem's expression showed nervousness and joy. "What is it?" he asked. Concerned. "I wanted to tell you this earlier. I thought the wedding would be the perfect time." "I'm pregnant," Layla said. Kareem's eyes widened. He was silent for a moment, processing her words. Then, a huge smile spread across his face. He pulled her into a tight embrace. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. "Yes," she replied, tears welling up in her eyes. Kareem cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. "You've just made the happiest day of my life even more perfect." He got down on one knee, putting his hands gently on Layla's stomach. Smiled at her. "I promise to be the best father I can be for Amir and for our baby." Layla laughed, tears streaming down her face. "I know you will be." In the month that followed, Layla and Kareem started building an even stronger life together. Kareem remained devoted to his family, while Layla discovered a new side of herself as a wife and soon to be mother. To once again, Amir was happy to be a mother. He had found a friend and partner in Kareem, who was like a father to him. A few months later, when the baby was born, Kareem held the tiny girl in his arms and was crying with happiness. Layla smiled at him. "She's perfect," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "She is Layla." They agreed, holding hands. As they looked at their new family, they knew that, despite all the challenges they had faced, they had found something more precious than they could have ever imagined, a true and lasting love. What did you think of Layla and Kareem's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. Click here on the end screen to see more emotional stories.